In the depths of the Cold War, when the Iron Curtain divided not just nations but ideologies, reality, and truth itself, a story emerged that seemed to crystallize every Western fear about Soviet experimentation. The Russian sleep experiment, as it came to be known, tells of 5 political prisoners sealed in a chamber somewhere in the Soviet Union during the late 1940s, subjected to an experimental gas designed to eliminate the human need for sleep. What allegedly transpired over those 15 days would become one of the most disturbing tales to circulate through the early internet, a story that blurred the lines between historical plausibility and pure nightmare fuel. As George Orwell wrote in 1984, published in 1949, coincidentally around the same period, this experiment supposedly took place. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. The Russian sleep experiment represents a different kind of eternal torment, consciousness without end, awareness without the mercy of oblivion. The tale positions itself in the immediate aftermath of World War II, a period when both the United States and the Soviet Union were racing to weaponize everything from atomic energy to the human mind itself. This wasn't entirely fiction. During these years, both superpowers genuinely pursued psychological warfare programs that sound like science fiction today. The CIA's MK-Ultra program, which ran from 1953 to 1973, experimented with mind control, sensory deprivation, and chemical interrogation, spending approximately $25 million on projects that included dosing unwitting American citizens with LSD. One victim, Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist, died after jumping from a New York hotel window in 1953, 9 days after being secretly given LSD by his colleagues. The details of his death remained classified for over 20 years. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist working at McGill University in Montreal under MK-Ultra funding, subjected patients to psychic driving, forcing them to listen to repeated messages while under drug-induced comas, sometimes for weeks. Many patients never fully recovered their memories or identities. The Soviets, meanwhile, were rumored to have their own shadowy programs exploring similar territory. In the closed city of Novosibirsk, the Institute of Cytology and Genetics conducted research that Western intelligence could only guess at. The notorious Serbsky Institute in Moscow became infamous for its use of psychiatry as a tool of political repression, diagnosing dissidents with sluggish schizophrenia, a convenient diagnosis that allowed the state to institutionalize anyone who questioned the party line. Vladimir Bukovsky, a Soviet dissident who spent 12 years in labor camps and psychiatric prisons, later testified that the Serbsky Institute turned psychiatry into a weapon more dreadful than all the tanks and machine guns. The Russian sleep experiment story taps into this very real historical context, suggesting that in some forgotten facility, perhaps in the Ural Mountains, where the closed city of Chelyabinsk 4-0 produced plutonium for Soviet nuclear weapons, or in the frozen wastes of Siberia, where Kolyma's camps earned the nickname the Pole of Cold and Cruelty. Soviet scientists pushed beyond all ethical boundaries in their quest to create the perfect soldier, one who never needed rest. The genius of the story lies in how it anchors itself to genuine scientific concerns about sleep deprivation. Sleep is not optional for human survival. It's as fundamental as food or water, a fact driven home by the fatal familial insomnia cases documented in medical literature. This rare genetic disorder prevents sleep entirely, and victims invariably die within months, their brains literally degenerating from the inability to rest. The longest scientifically documented case of a person staying awake was Randy Gardner in 1964, a 17-year-old high school student from San Diego who remained conscious for 264 hours, 11 days, as part of a science fair project. Researchers from Stanford University, including Dr. William Dement, a pioneer in sleep research, monitored him throughout, documenting the progressive deterioration of his cognitive and physical functions. By day 4, Gardner experienced hallucinations, believing he was Paul Lowe, a famous football player. By day 11, his short-term memory had collapsed completely. He couldn't remember the beginning of a sentence. By the time he reached its end, his speech was slurred, and he exhibited symptoms resembling early-stage dementia. His eyes stopped focusing properly. He became paranoid, believing people were conspiring against him. Yet remarkably, he recovered fully after sleeping for 14 hours straight, waking up essentially normal. Gardner later said he wouldn't recommend anyone try to break his record, and Guinness World Records eventually stopped accepting submissions for sleep deprivation after medical experts warned of the dangers. The military has long been fascinated by conquering sleep, viewing it as an evolutionary weakness to be overcome. Napoleon Bonaparte reportedly claimed 6 hours sleep for a man, 7 for a woman, 8 for a fool, though historians note he also took frequent naps and likely suffered from sleep deprivation that contributed to poor decision-making at Waterloo. During World War II, both Allied and Axis forces experimented with amphetamines to keep soldiers alert. The Luftwaffe issued methamphetamine tablets called Pervitin to pilots during extended missions. The Wehrmacht distributed an estimated 35 million tablets to German forces between April and December 1939 alone. Heinrich Böll, the German novelist who served in the Wehrmacht, wrote letters to his family requesting Pervitin shipments, describing the drug as essential for surviving long marches and combat. American forces used Benzedrine, nicknamed Go Pills, which continued in various forms through the Korean War, Vietnam, and even into modern conflicts. In 2002, 2 Air Force pilots dropped a bomb on Canadian forces in Afghanistan, killing 4 soldiers, after taking the amphetamine, dextroamphetamine, during a mission they claimed the drug affected their judgment. The U.S. Air Force still allows controlled use of stimulants for pilots on lengthy operations, though protocols have been revised. But these were always temporary measures, buying hours of alertness at the cost of inevitable crashes, psychological deterioration, and sometimes addiction. Soviet forces had their own programs. Tank crews in World War II were often given vodka mixed with cocaine, called vint, to maintain alertness during grueling battles. The idea of eliminating sleep entirely remained in the realm of fantasy or horror. Dr. J. Allen Hobson, a Harvard psychiatrist and dream researcher, once noted that sleep is of the brain, by the brain, and for the brain, emphasizing that consciousness without rest isn't enhanced awareness, but a form of neurological poisoning. What the Russian sleep experiment proposes goes far beyond anything attempted in reality. According to the narrative, 5 political prisoners, enemies of the state, deemed expendable, were selected for an experiment that would test a newly developed gas, a stimulant so powerful it could keep humans awake indefinitely. The setup was clinical in its cruelty. A sealed chamber, stripped of anything that might allow self-harm or suicide, equipped with books, running water, a toilet, enough dried food for a month, and microphones to monitor the subjects. The gas would be continuously pumped in, and the prisoners were promised freedom after 30 days if they remained awake the entire time. This promise mirrors the false hope offered to countless real prisoners in totalitarian experiments. Joseph Mengele promised Jewish twins special treatment at Auschwitz. Japanese Unit 731 promised Chinese prisoners medical care before infecting them with plague, and Soviet interrogators promised leniency to extract confessions that led to execution. The scientists running this fictional experiment would have been products of Stalin's Soviet Union, a system that by the late 1942 had already demonstrated its capacity for treating human beings as experimental material. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 had normalized the idea of enemies of the people who existed outside the protection of society, with Stalin himself declaring, "Death solves all problems, no man, no problem." The Gulag system held millions at its peak, with approximately 18 million people passing through the camps between 1930 and 1953. Stories of medical experiments in these camps, while less systematically documented than those in Nazi concentration camps, weren't entirely absent from historical record. Varlam Shalamov, who survived 17 years in Kolyma camps, wrote in his Kolyma Tales of prisoners being used as test subjects for cold endurance, fed minimal rations to study starvation effects, and subjected to psychological torture that broke even the strongest minds. Soviet psychiatry, in particular, became infamous for diagnosing political dissent as mental illness, a practice that continued well into the 1980 seconds. Andrei Snezhnevsky, director of the Institute of Psychiatry, developed the concept of sluggish schizophrenia, specifically to pathologize political opposition, allowing the state to institutionalize poets, scientists, and human rights activists without trials. The 5 prisoners in the story remain nameless, faceless, a detail that actually strengthens the narrative's impact. They're defined only by their status as test subjects, stripped of identity in the same way real prisoners were reduced to numbers in the camps. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who documented the Gulag experience in the Gulag archipelago, wrote that the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, suggesting that the dehumanization of prisoners required the moral corruption of those who imprisoned them. The experiment's parameters seem almost reasonable at first. 15 days initially, though the promise extends to 30. 15 days isn't impossibly long. Randy Gardner made it to 11 without any chemical assistance, and Peter Tripp, a New York DJ, stayed awake for 201 hours in 1959 as a publicity stunt, broadcasting from a glass booth in Times Square before experiencing complete psychological breakdown. With a stimulant gas, surely conscious wakefulness could be maintained for just a few days longer. But the story understands something crucial about sleep deprivation that makes it such effective horror material. Sleep isn't just rest for the body, it's essential maintenance for the mind. During REM sleep, the brain processes emotions, consolidates memories, and quite literally cleans itself of toxic proteins that accumulate during waking hours through a system called the glymphatic system, discovered only in 2012. Deny a human being this process for long enough, and the mind doesn't just get tired, it begins to fracture, to hallucinate, to lose its grip on what's real and what isn't. The boundary between consciousness and dreaming starts to dissolve. Dr. Matthew Walker, author of Why We Sleep, describes severe sleep deprivation as creating a state where the brain begins to eat itself, with immune function collapsing, emotional regulation vanishing, and reality testing failing completely. Rats kept awake die within 2 to 3 weeks, and autopsies show brain damage consistent with extreme stress and neurological poisoning. The gas chamber itself becomes a character in the story, a sealed world where normal rules gradually cease to apply. Those monitoring the experiment watch through one-way glass and listen through microphones, maintaining their clinical distance even as they bear witness to whatever unfolds within. This observer dynamic mirrors real ethical concerns that emerged during Cold War-era experiments, where researchers maintained detailed notes on human suffering while telling themselves it was for the greater good, for national security, for science. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments at Yale in 1961 demonstrated how easily ordinary people could be convinced to inflict harm when following orders from authority figures in lab coats. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment in 1971 showed how quickly experimental situations could spiral into abuse when participants were dehumanized and divided into prisoners and guards. The fictional Soviet scientists observing their sealed chamber would have operated under similar psychological dynamics: professional detachment, ideological justification, and the gradual normalization of atrocity. As Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil, the greatest horrors are often committed not by monsters, but by bureaucrats who see themselves as merely doing their jobs. The first 5 days passed with deceptive normality. The prisoners in their sealed chamber talked among themselves, read the provided books, and adapted to their artificial environment with the resilience that humans often display when survival depends on cooperation. The researchers monitoring them through one-way glass noted everything in their logbooks with clinical precision sleep patterns. None, as intended, food consumption, regular. Conversation topics, mundane complaints about the chamber's temperature, speculation about the outside world, memories of life before imprisonment. This initial calm mirrors what psychologists call the honeymoon phase of extreme stress situations, where subjects initially cope through denial and routine building. When Terry Waite was held hostage in Lebanon for nearly 5 years, much of it in solitary confinement chained to a radiator in a Beirut basement, he later described the first days as almost bearable, his mind not yet comprehending the true extent of his isolation. He would later write that suffering is unbearable if you aren't certain that it will end. Brian Keenan, another Beirut hostage held for 4.5 years, described how captives initially maintained elaborate routines, exercises, mental games, invented schedules to preserve their sense of normalcy. The Russian sleep experiment subjects existed in a similar bubble of false security, their bodies chemically prevented from sleep, but their minds not yet understanding the horror of endless wakefulness. During the Apollo 11 mission in 1969, NASA found that astronauts deprived of adequate sleep became irritable and made errors, but they could still function for short periods. The first few days of the experiment would have felt like that, challenging but manageable, the body's alarm systems not yet screaming their warnings. By day 5, the prisoners stopped talking to each other. This wasn't a gradual trailing off of conversation, but an abrupt, synchronized silence that unsettled the researchers, as if some unspoken agreement had passed between the 5 men that words had become meaningless or dangerous. The microphones picked up only breathing, the occasional footstep, the sound of pages turning. One prisoner stood facing a corner for hours, motionless, his forehead pressed against the concrete wall in a posture eerily reminiscent of punishment methods used in Soviet psychiatric facilities. Another walked in precise circles around the chamber's perimeter, counting his steps in whispers, raz, dva, tri, chetaya, over and over, until the numbers lost meaning and became pure sound, reaching into the thousands before starting again at 1. This withdrawal into individual isolation within a shared space reflects documented responses to extreme psychological stress. In 1951, Donald Hebb conducted sensory deprivation experiments at McGill University in Montreal, placing volunteers in soundproof chambers with frosted visors over their eyes and cardboard tubes over their arms to minimize tactile sensation. Within hours, subjects reported anxiety and disorientation. Within 48 hours, they experienced vivid hallucinations. One saw processions of squirrels with sacks over their shoulders marching purposefully across the snow. Most couldn't tolerate more than 3 days despite being paid $20 per day, excellent wages for 1,951. John Lilly, the neuroscientist who later invented the isolation tank, spent hours floating in darkness and silence during the 1,950 seconds and reported encountering what he described as other entities in the depths of his own consciousness. The sleep-deprived prisoners, unable to escape into unconsciousness and trapped with 4 other deteriorating minds, began retreating inward, each creating a mental bunker against the encroaching madness. Winston Churchill, who battled depression, he called his black dog, once observed, "When you're going through hell, keep going." But what happens when there's nowhere to go? When consciousness itself becomes the hell you cannot escape? The screaming started on day 9. Not the screaming of pain or fear, but something more primal, wordless, sustained shrieks that lasted for hours, sometimes overlapping as multiple prisoners joined in a horrifying chorus that the researchers could hear even through the chamber's soundproofing. The screams didn't sound like protests or calls for help, but like the vocal equivalent of seizures, involuntary expulsions of sound from minds that could no longer contain their deterioration. The researchers, monitoring from their observation room with its dials and recording equipment, debated stopping the experiment. Dr. Mikhail Petrov, a fictional name that represents the archetype of the Soviet scientist caught between ambition and conscience. Perhaps modeled on real figures like Vladimir Demikov, the Soviet scientist who grafted dog heads onto other dogs in the 1,950 seconds, wrote in his log that the sounds did not seem entirely human. This detail echoes real observations from extreme situations. survivors of the siege of Leningrad, which lasted 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, and killed over 1 million people through starvation, described how hunger changed people's voices, making them unrecognizable, reducing communication to animal-like grunts and moans. Primo Levi, documenting his time in Auschwitz, wrote of the Muselmen, prisoners so broken they moved like automatons, their voices reduced to monotone whispers, their eyes empty of anything recognizable as human consciousness. Levi noted that their life is short, but their number is endless. They, the Muselmänner, the drowned, form the backbone of the camp, an anonymous mass, continually renewed and always identical, of non-men who march and labor in silence. The sleep-deprived prisoners' screams represented not just distress but a fundamental transformation, consciousness pushed beyond its evolutionary limits into territory that neuroscience could barely comprehend. Edvard Munch, the Norwegian painter who created The Scream in 1893, wrote in his diary about the inspiration. "I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting suddenly, the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leaned on the fence. There was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends walked on, and I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. The prisoners in their chamber had become living embodiments of that scream, consciousness itself crying out against its unnatural extension. Between the screaming episodes came whispered conversations with entities the researchers couldn't see, dialogues with the empty air that suggested the prisoners' minds were populating their isolation with phantom companions. The microphones captured one prisoner pleading with someone named Anastasia, begging her forgiveness for something unspecified, his voice breaking with genuine grief for a sin he might have invented in his deteriorating mind. Another held elaborate arguments with himself in two distinct voices, one accusatory and harsh with a Moscow accent, the other defensive and whimpering in what sounded like a Ukrainian dialect, as if different aspects of his personality had separated and were now warring for dominance. This fracturing of identity mirrors the symptoms observed in extreme sleep deprivation studies conducted worldwide. Peter Tripp, the New York DJ, who stayed awake for 201 hours in January 1959 as a publicity stunt to raise money for the March of Dimes, broadcasting from a glass booth in Times Square while doctors monitored him, began experiencing vivid hallucinations. By day 4, he saw flames shooting from a drawer, believed a doctor's tweed suit was made of worms, became convinced that a scientist was actually an undertaker come to bury him alive, and attacked several people trying to help him. His personality changed so drastically that friends said he seemed to be someone else wearing Peter Tripp's face. Even after finally sleeping, Tripp suffered lasting personality changes and depression, his marriage later falling apart. He told researchers, "I was no longer myself." Neurologist J. Alan Hobson explained that prolonged wakefulness causes the brain's reality-testing mechanisms, primarily governed by the prefrontal cortex, to fail catastrophically. The boundary between internal thought and external perception dissolves, and the mind essentially begins dreaming while awake, unable to distinguish hallucination from reality. Dr. William Dement, who monitored Randy Gardner during his 11-day wakefulness marathon, noted that by day 4, Gardner couldn't remember what he'd said moments before, experienced paranoid delusions that people were ganging up on him, and had trouble identifying familiar objects. The brain literally cannot function properly without sleep, Dement later wrote. It's not weakness, it's biology. On day 12, the researchers observed the first incidents of self-mutilation. One prisoner used his fingernails grown long during the experiment, uncut and sharp, to tear at his thighs, methodically shredding the skin in long strips, peeling away layers of epidermis and dermis with the focused intensity of someone unwrapping a present. The watching researchers noted that his face showed no pain, only intense concentration, as if he were performing necessary surgery on foreign flesh. Another beat his head against the chamber wall with rhythmic precision, the thuds captured clearly by the microphones. Thud, pause, like a metronome keeping time with madness. continuing until blood ran down the concrete but never accelerating or slowing, maintaining perfect tempo. The most disturbing incident involved a prisoner who tore pages from the books provided works of socialist realism by Gorky and Sholokov, approved reading material for Soviet prisoners, and attempted to plaster them against the one-way mirror using his own blood as adhesive, creating a collage of text fragments that the researchers later photographed for their reports. The words formed no coherent message, but witnesses reported an overwhelming sense of wrongness when viewing the arrangement, as if the randomness itself conveyed meaning their conscious minds couldn't process, like looking at alien hieroglyphics. This compulsion to create meaning from chaos, even through self-destruction, reflects what psychiatrists observe in extreme psychotic breaks. During the Cultural Revolution in China from 1966 to 1976, prisoners subjected to sleep deprivation during struggle sessions, sometimes kept awake for weeks through constant interrogation, and forced standing confess to impossible crimes, constructing elaborate false narratives about being American spies or counter-revolutionary conspirators that became more real to them than their actual memories. In Korean War POW camps, Chinese captors used sleep deprivation so effectively that captured American pilots signed false confessions to using biological weapons, believing their own coerced statements. Dr. Lawrence Hinkle, who studied these interrogation techniques for the CIA in the 1950 seconds, concluded that a prisoner deprived of sleep for even 48 hours becomes markedly confused and highly suggestible. After 72 hours, most subjects can no longer distinguish between reality and hallucination. The sleep-deprived subjects in the experiment, now approaching 2 weeks without rest, had long passed this threshold. The mind, deprived of sleep's restorative processes, begins consuming itself, creating new realities to replace the unbearable one it inhabits, cannibalizing memory and reason to fuel its desperate attempts to make sense of existence. The gas itself became a subject of intense speculation among the fictional researchers and, later, among those who encountered this story online, with internet forums debating whether such a compound could exist. What compound could sustain wakefulness for weeks while driving subjects to such extremes? Historically, various stimulants have been weaponized or tested for military purposes, with varying degrees of success and horror. The Nazis experimented with D-Ix, a cocaine-based performance enhancer developed at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, combining 5 milligrams of methamphetamine, 5 milligrams of cocaine, and 5 milligrams of oxycodone per tablet. Tests on prisoners forced to march while carrying 20-kilogram backpacks showed subjects could walk 90 kilometers without rest before collapsing. Soviet scientists explored substances derived from Siberian ginseng and Rhodiola rosea, plants that grew in extreme Siberian conditions, for their adaptogenic properties that supposedly allowed the body to resist stress. The secret Soviet sports programs, which dominated Olympic competitions during the Cold War, used elaborate cocktails of stimulants that weren't discovered until decades later. The U.S. military investigated modafinil and its more powerful cousin, armodafinil, drugs originally developed to treat narcolepsy, but repurposed to keep soldiers alert during extended operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Pilots flying bombing runs over Baghdad sometimes took go pills, amphetamines, before missions, and no-go pills, sedatives, afterward, creating a chemical yo-yo that damaged long-term cognitive function. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency responsible for developing the Internet and GPS, has invested millions in research to reduce soldiers' sleep requirements, including studying genetic mutations that allow certain individuals like Margaret Thatcher and Napoleon to function on 4 hours of sleep nightly. One DARPA program investigated the genes of migratory birds that stay awake for days during long flights. Yet all known stimulants eventually fail against the body's fundamental need for unconsciousness. Fatal familial insomnia proves that prolonged wakefulness isn't survivable. The fictional gas in the Russian sleep experiment represents something more symbolic than chemical. It's the weaponization of consciousness itself, the transformation of awareness from a gift into a curse, a tool of control that strips away the one refuge humans have from suffering, the mercy of oblivion. As Macbeth cried, "Methought, I heard a voice cry, 'Sleep no more.' Macbeth does murder sleep, the innocent sleep, sleep that knits up the ravelled sleeve of care. The death of each day's life, sore labour's bath, balm of hurt minds, great nature's second course, chief nourisher in life's feast." Shakespeare understood that sleep's absence is a special kind of death, a killing of renewal itself. By day 15, when the researchers finally decided to open the chamber after 3 days of complete silence, they reported ominous quiet from within. The microphones had been destroyed 3 days earlier during a fit of rage from one of the prisoners who had apparently climbed on another's shoulders to reach the ceiling-mounted device and tear it down, the sounds of metal scraping and wires snapping captured before transmission ceased. The observation window was completely covered by the blood and paper collage, preventing visual monitoring, the crimson-brown stains creating abstract patterns that one researcher compared to Rorschach tests, though what they might reveal about the subject's psyches was too disturbing to contemplate. When the chamber door was unsealed, its 15-day-old seals cracking and releasing pressurized air, the rush of atmosphere that escaped was described by witnesses as thick with the smell of ammonia and decay, suggesting bodily functions had degraded beyond normal human waste to something resembling the putrefaction of death. The scene inside resembled something from a medieval nightmare painted by Hieronymus Bosch, or from the photographs that Soviet soldiers took when liberating Nazi death camps, images of human bodies pushed beyond the limits of what bodies should endure. The specifics varied in different tellings of the story as it spread across the internet, mutating like a virus. But consistent elements included torn flesh hanging in strips, exposed muscle still twitching with unnatural vitality, prisoners who had consumed portions of their own tissue, and the absolute destruction of anything resembling the original experimental environment. The books had been shredded, the furniture demolished, the walls covered in substances that analysis would later identify as combinations of blood, feces, and partially digested food. 3 prisoners were dead, or appeared to be, until researchers approached, and they opened their eyes. Pupils dilated to black pools that reflected the overhead lights like cameras rather than human organs. 2 remained standing in opposite corners of the chamber, covered in wounds that should have been fatal. One had removed most of the flesh from his abdomen, exposing his digestive system, yet somehow remained conscious and mobile, their bodies operating on some principle beyond normal physiology, as if sheer willpower or the stimulant gas had overridden the usual fail-safes that shut down a human system under catastrophic damage. What truly haunted those who heard the tale wasn't the gore. The internet had already become desensitized to shock imagery by the time this story circulated in the 2010 seconds, but the response when researchers offered medical help and promised to end the experiment. The surviving subjects became violent, attacking anyone who tried to remove them from the chamber with a ferocity that seemed impossible given their injuries. They begged, pleaded, and screamed to be sealed back inside with the gas flowing again, fighting against the medics and soldiers who had been called in to restrain them. And when asked why, one subject, his vocal cords damaged from days of screaming, speaking in a whisper the microphone barely captured, delivered the line that would echo through internet forums, creepypasta websites, and horror communities for years: "We no longer want to be freed." This statement, in its terrible simplicity, captures something profound about consciousness and suffering that philosophers have wrestled with for millennia. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps including Auschwitz and Dachau, wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that the last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. He observed fellow prisoners who maintained their humanity even in the camps, and others who became brutalized. But what happens when consciousness itself becomes the prison, when awareness transforms into torture, when the only escape is sleep, and that escape has been chemically denied for 2 weeks? The prisoner's refusal of freedom suggests that something fundamental had broken not just their sanity, but their understanding of what it meant to be human, their connection to the basic categories that organize human experience: safety versus danger, pain versus relief, captivity versus freedom. They had crossed a threshold where normal existence became intolerable, where the ordinary human condition of sleeping and waking felt like a cage compared to their heightened, nightmarish state. Fyodor Dostoevsky, who faced a mock execution and spent 4 years in a Siberian labor camp, wrote in Notes from Underground that man is sometimes extraordinarily, passionately in love with suffering, suggesting a dark truth about human consciousness, that we can become attached, even to our torments, when they define our reality completely. The recorded dialogue continued, according to the story, with increasingly disturbing revelations that transformed the narrative from medical horror into philosophical nightmare. The subjects claimed they had discovered something during their sleepless ordeal, accessed parts of consciousness normally locked away during waking hours, dimensions of awareness that sleep exists to suppress. "We are you," one allegedly whispered to the researchers through torn lips. "We are the you hide every time you close your eyes. We are what remains when the meat sleeps." This philosophical turn transforms the story from simple body horror into existential dread, suggesting that sleep doesn't just rest the body, but suppresses something dark within consciousness itself, some ancient, predatory awareness that civilization has evolved to contain through the mercy of daily unconsciousness. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, the repressed, primitive aspects of the psyche that contain our evolutionary inheritance of aggression, sexuality, and survival instincts, finds its most literal interpretation here. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. He believed that confronting the shadow was necessary for psychological wholeness. But what if that confrontation went too far? What if consciousness dove so deep into its own darkness that it could never return to the light? The prisoners hadn't gone mad. They had become purely, terribly conscious, stripped of the illusions and repressions that make human society possible, seeing themselves and reality with a clarity that destroyed everything recognizable as human thought. Nietzsche's famous warning from Beyond Good and Evil echoes here. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. The prisoners had gazed into the abyss of total consciousness for 15 days without the relief of sleep's blindfold, and they had found not enlightenment but horror, the realization that the thinking, feeling self we consider our identity is actually a thin veneer over something far older and more terrible, something that sleep mercifully locks away each night like a dangerous animal caged for everyone's protection. When the researchers finally forced sedation on the surviving subjects, injecting them with powerful barbiturates despite their violent resistance, they reportedly died within moments, their hearts stopping almost simultaneously, as if sleep and death had become synonymous for beings who had transgressed so far beyond normal human consciousness. Their final expressions, witnesses claimed, showed not relief but the most profound terror, the look of something being dragged back into a cage it had finally escaped, the expression of condemned prisoners being led to execution. One researcher who was present, supposedly suffering nightmares for years afterward, described their faces as showing the terror of something that had touched infinity being forced back into the finite, the horror of gods being made mortal again. The subjects' bodies were allegedly cremated immediately, the chamber sterilized and sealed, and all research materials classified at levels beyond top secret, buried in archives that may or may not exist in the labyrinths beneath Moscow's bureaucratic fortresses. In Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum, the narrator describes his terror. "I saw that the crescent was designed to cross the region of the heart. It would fray the serge of my robe. It would return and repeat its operations again and again." The Russian sleep experiment subjects had experienced consciousness as an endless pendulum, swinging through the same terrible awareness again and again without the interruption of sleep's mercy, until awareness itself became the blade that slowly killed them, not through the body's failure, but through the mind's transformation into something that could no longer coexist with human flesh. Their deaths suggested that perhaps sleep is not a weakness to be overcome, but a fundamental requirement of being human, that consciousness, uninterrupted and extended beyond its natural limits, doesn't transcend humanity but destroys it, revealing something underneath that should never be allowed to surface. And so we leave the shadows of 1,940 seconds, Soviet science, where the Russian sleep deprivation experiment whispers a final warning some doors were never meant to stay open. Whether myth or mirror, the story reminds us that the mind frays long before the body breaks. As Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote, "The soul is healed by being with children, and ruined by being awake too long in the dark." Sleep well, and remember, the most terrifying experiments don't need laboratories, only consciousness.